always been there, but we're now entering into what I've been calling, I hate the word, but I can't think of a better one to characterize that momentum, which I'm calling post-structuralism. The post-structuralism and the post-structuralism. I hate that. But again, because of its etymology, structuralism, structuring of time, is an imperative to keep that, to be aware of the fact that this momentum from the post-structuralist through the post-post-structuralist is a momentum which is radically deconstructing the spatialization, the structuring of time, the making time into a picture. That's absolutely crucial, and I have to say that up until quite recently, and even among the post-post-structuralists, this has not been manifest enough in my mind. It's not been manifest enough in my mind. You'll see it as you go through Agamben and Badiou and Zizek. But nevertheless, far more prominent than previous. So we're entering now into this post-structuralist phase, by which I mean, of course, the radicalization, the world-defying, if you will, the worlding of the post-structuralist tendency to be unworldly insofar as they focus primarily or overdetermine primarily the ontological site and its relationship to language and the subject. They didn't go much farther beyond that. They did, but it wasn't systematic. It was as if these entering into the more political, worldly sites was sort of accidental. Their focus was almost entirely on this highly rarefied aspect of the worldliness of being. Again, I said before, and I'll say again, there's some justification for this, and that is for their not being fully conscious of the potential of this destructuring of being for political, for worldly politics. And that is that, as I said much earlier, that is because the question of language, which hitherto had been conceived by virtually everybody, except for minor, except for marginalized figures throughout the history of Western civilization, was assumed to be, language was assumed to be transparent, simply a medium that represented what you were intended to represent. And the post-structuralists, therefore, given the fact that language now becomes, as I've called it, thickened a problem, they focused on that problem problem in order to show how enormously difficult it was to undermine the authority of a modernism, liberal, capitalist, democratic modernism that relied on language as language came to be understood, disinterested, detached, objective, you know the whole story, concealing the ideology that informed it in the name of disinterested inquiry, in the name of disinterested language. So that was their first problem, and they didn't get beyond that, except on occasion. And that's understandable. They had to point out, this is Derrida's entire project. Language is a serious problem, whereas prior, and it was very hard to convince anybody that when Derrida's deconstruction, these deconstructive works started coming out in the United States, they thought that this guy was some kind of radical truth hater. So disturbing was this attack upon what? Disinterested inquiry. We modernists who articulate what's happening in the modern world are not ideologues. We're detached scientists. We're objective inquirers. How can you penetrate that mentality? And that's what these guys were doing, and they had every justification to do that. Problem is, as I say, that they did not go beyond that, or they did not seriously go beyond that, and this is where the post-structures come in. But so we're now talking about Agamben, but Agamben, who in many ways, in my mind, is, well, I don't want to say the most important, but the one who most clearly in his writing is seen by now, if you've been reading Agamben, Homo Saka, the state of exception, so on and so forth, having community. Because Agamben most clearly shows his roots in the post-structure, or more particularly in Heidegger's destruction of the ontotheological tradition. I'm sure that you cannot have missed that in the process of reading Agamben, whatever you've read of this. The two things I want to do preliminary, by way of preliminary entry into Agamben's thinking, and I'm going to talk about Agamben's thinking not systematically in terms of each book. I'm going to talk about him in general. I assume that you've read these books by this time, and you don't need a explication to text of each one of these. I'm going to talk about Agamben in general, but I will refer to a number of the text. I will refer to all the text that we've talked about in the class, in the process of what I'm going to say. But before I do that, again, to reestablish the pattern clearly in your mind is crucial. I want to return to the, and that, and in order to, I want to return to, emphasize that, I want to return to two moments of our past in this class. The Heidegger moment when he talks about standing reserve, and the moment in discussion of Said where he talks about the refugee. Those two, as synectical of everything that's crucial about, that has been crucial about what we said about these people. And again, one of the not the least reasons for doing this is to again to assert Said's role in this process, from the post-structuralist to the post-post-structuralist. Because, as I've said over and over again, and for reasons that he himself is to blame, he inaugurated a critique of post-structuralists, of the post-structuralists, particularly deconstruction, Derrida, that was interpreted by his followers, what we've been calling the worldly critics, who followed him, as a rejection of post-structuralism as such, in favor of a worldly criticism. Whereas what I'm saying is that it wasn't a rejection of post-structuralism. It was a recognition that they had not gone far enough. They did not pursue their deep and revolutionary insight into the domain of the more worldly political sites on the continuum of being. That is one reason why I'm claiming that Said is part of this continuum between the post-structuralists. But again, I've said this before, and I'll repeat, that's controversial. And you have to, those of you who want to explore this whole continuum I've been invoking, will have to take that into consideration. You just can't say it because I've said it too. You've got to do this on your own. You can make your own decisions about that. Okay, the first passage from Heidegger. I invoked Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology primarily in order to show how proleptic he was of the post-structuralism, particularly Agamben, and the idea of, and Agamben's notion of bare life, almost life. You remember these passages. I'll just read them rapidly to recall them, to recall them to you. What kind of concealment is it then that that is peculiar to that which comes to stand forth through this setting upon the challenges, that enframing we talked about, that structuralizing, enframing. Everywhere, everything is ordered to stand by, to be immediately at hand. Indeed, to stand there just so that it be on call for further ordering. Whatever is ordered about in this way has its own standing. We call it standing reserve. My term, remember, is disposable reserve, to emphasize the radicality of standing reserve. Bestan. The word expresses here something more and something more essential than mere stock. The name standing reserve assumes the rank of an inclusive rubric. It designates nothing less than the way in which everything presences that is wrought upon by the challenging, revealing, and framing. Whatever stands by in the sense of standing reserve or disposable reserve no longer stands over against us as object. The second passage from Heidegger is where he says, when this happens, when man becomes the master, man becomes mastered. Man himself becomes standing reserve, becomes disposable reserve. You can see now, those who know, you've read Homo-Saka, you know now where Agamben is coming from, at least one very crucial aspect of Agamben's analysis of bare life. And that passage is, yet when distancing reigns in the name of enframing, it is the supreme danger. This danger itself attests itself to us in two ways. As soon as what is unconcealed no longer concerns man even as object, but does so rather exclusively as standing reserve, the objectification of being takes one further step, becomes now not just an object to be mastered, but becomes standing reserve, disposable reserve. And man, in the midst of objectlessness, is nothing but the orderer of the standing reserve. Then he comes to the very brink of a precipitous fall. That is, he comes to the point where he himself will have to be taken as standing reserve. Meanwhile, man, precisely as the one, and this is the great irony, of course, precisely as the one so threatened, exalts himself in the posture of Lord of the earth. The term, of course, is the master of all man surveys. The master of all that man surveys. Precisely as the one so threatened exalts himself to the posture of Lord of the earth. In this way, the impression comes to prevail that everything man encounters exists insofar as it is his construct. This illusion gives rise in turn to one final delusion. It seems as though man everywhere and always encounters only himself. In truth, however, precisely nowhere does man today any longer encounter himself, i.e. his essence. Man has been so objectified that for him the truth of man is this man as standing reserve, at the expense of the dynamic living human being that he is primordially when he is in his throne condition and in relation to the radical temporality of being. He has become not only objectified, but he has become standing reserve. This master who claims he's master. He has become totally dehumanized. Totally dehumanized. Bare life. Agamben picks up on this and calls it, no better term, bare life. And, of course, as I've pointed out earlier, and will go on pointing out, the post-structuralists following Agamben will, not necessarily following Agamben, but in the line of this, thinking the potentialities of destructuration, will give various names to, but all of them absolutely related, ungrievable to the part of no part, Rancière, the countless, Badiou, among other terms he uses to talk about food, and so on and so on and so forth. Standing so decisively in attendance on the challenging force, notice that in attendance, which means subject to the call of the higher cause that is the vocation of objectified man, of dehumanized man. Man stands so decisively in attendance on the challenging forth of framing as a claim that he fails to see himself as the one spoken to, and hence also fails in every way to hear in what respect he exists as ontological outsider, insider. Again, to be human, Heidegger said, was to be existent, insistent, outside, inside. Heidegger's term for that was Geworfenheit, thrown in the world, exiled in the world, an exilic figure, a refugee in the world. This is where the second passage that I want to focus on from our past, Said's invocation of the refugee as the figure that characterizes humanity in the post-9/11 era, or the post-imperial era after imperialism implodes, self-destruct. But let me finish the passage from Heidegger. Hence, also fails in every way to hear in what respect he exists, is an ontological outsider, insider, between the transcendental and the secular world. From out of his existence, in the realm of an exhortation or address, and thus can never encounter only himself. Can never encounter only himself. The second passage, which I spent quite a bit of time on, is from Said, and I'll simply read this. I'm not going to explicate it in any depth. Just to recall your attention to it. For surely, this is at the end of, we remember, at the end of cultural imperialism, when he, invoking Deleuze and Guattari and Paul Virilio, he diagnoses contemporary post-imperial occasion. For surely it is one of the unhappiest characteristics of the age to produce more refugees, migrants, displaced persons, and exiles than ever before in history. And I'm doing this because I'm re-quoting this, particularly this passage, I could have quoted others, but particularly this passage that focuses on the idea of the refugee as a kind of symbolic figure of modern humanity. Because as you probably have already recognized, I've already seen in your reading of Agamben, particularly means of the one of the chapters on the idea of refugee in Means Without End, Said picks up on that. His version, his notion of the refugee as a major figure, primordial figure, as a fundamental figure of modernity, derives from Hannah Arendt, not from Said. But the relation and the analysis of the refugee by Agamben via Hannah Arendt is remarkably similar to that of Said in this particular passage. And above all, both the idea of the refugee and the way the refugee is defined, is characterized by all these figures is remarkably similar to each other. And again, this is not minor because what these people are establishing is the refugee as the defining figure of contemporary modernity, as the essence of the condition we have inherited from the Western, the liminal moment of the Western civilization, the imperial project. For surely it is one of the unhappy characteristics of the age to have produced more refugees, migrants, displaced persons, and exiles than ever before in history. Most of them as an accompaniment to, and ironically enough, as afterthoughts. Said is looking at this situation, but from a contrapuntal perspective, from the perspective of his recognition that these people have been disavowed, that this aspect of modernity has been disavowed. As accompaniment to, and ironic enough, as afterthought of the great post-colonial and imperial conflict. As the struggle of independence produced new states and new boundaries, it also produced homeless wanderers, nomads, and vagrants, unassimilated to the emerging structures of institutional power, rejected by the established order for their intransigence and obdurate rebelliousness. Here, think of what we were talking about last time, the Palestinian condition of the Palestinians. And vagrants, unassimilated to the emergent structures of institutional power, rejected by the established order for their intransigence and obdurate rebelliousness. And insofar as these people exist between the old world and the new, between the old empire and the new state, in between, their condition articulates the tension, irresolution, and contradictions in the overlapping territories shown on the cultural map of imperialism. There is a great difference, Said goes on, however, between the optimistic mobility, the intellectual liveliness, and the logic of daring described by the various theoreticians on whose work I have drawn, and the massive dislocation, waste, misery, and horrors endured in our century's migrations and mutilated lives. Yet, as horrible as it is no exaggeration to say that liberation as an intellectual mission, born in the resistance and opposition to the confinement and ravages of imperialism, has now shifted. He's orienting us towards a radically new kind of resistance, a new kind of politics, a new kind of polis. Shifted from the settled, established, and domesticated dynamics of culture, those that were in place and permissible to the democratic, capitalist, imperial project, to its shifted from the settled, established, and domesticated dynamics of culture to its unhoused, decentered, and exilic energies, energies whose incarnation today is the migrant and whose consciousness is that of the intellectual and artist in exile. In exile. One of the things that you already must have come across in reading Agamben, by way of the influence of Hannah Arendt on his work, is his invocation of the refugee as a figure very similar to Said, the figure of the refugee. I'll say something more about this genealogy, which I'm tracing from the idea of Heidegger's concept of man thrown in the world, exile in the world, Geworfen, through Hannah Arendt, his students, notion of the refugee, which is a radicalization based on her own experience as a Jewish refugee from Germany. What she called the equivalent of Said's exilic consciousness, conscious pariah. She referred to herself as a conscious pariah, not just a pariah, but a conscious pariah, an exile, conscious pariah, aware, in other words, of what it means to have been exiled from one's community. I'll come back to that. Trying to establish the genealogy in a way that is unmistakable. You can't escape it. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, so the genealogy that you posited, right, it seems a little bit, like, to me, Eurocentric in certain ways, because, for example, Eurocentric, the genealogy, because, like, for example, the refugee, right, as described by Arendt, or, like, those types of figures seem very, like, European, right, in the sense that, like, I think that U.S. imperialism, for example, first started on, like, indigenous people. Right.
One of the things, yes, I know what you're saying. One of the things that Said is totally committed to is to break that distinction down between the Eurocentric and post-colonial critics, and to show that this situation applies to everybody.
Mm.
The Jews are part of this. The history of the modern Jews, their destruction by Nazism is part of the same process. See what I'm saying?
Mm.
And this is not a minor matter, because it is crucial to understand that Said is not, as he's been claimed to be, anti-Zion or anti-Jewish. He has enormous sympathy for the condition, for the plight of the Jews in the context of the period of the Nazis, what happened to the period of the Nazis. It applies not only to post-colonial peoples, but also to peoples within European context. In this particular case, the Jews. It is no exaggeration to say the liberation as an intellectual mission, born in the resistance and opposition to the confinements and ravages of imperialism, has now shifted from the settled, established, and domesticated dynamics of culture to its unhoused, decentered, and exilic energies whose incarnation today is the migrant, and whose consciousness is that of the intellectual and artist in exile. The political figure between domains, between forms, between homes, and between languages as a whole continuum of being. From this perspective, then, all things are indeed counter, original, spare, strange. Things have become estranged. What is familiar is no longer familiar. Everything is now new. Everything is now potential. From this perspective also, one can see he moves now from a mode of resistance, the potential for a mode of resistance, the resistance of being in between, to a coming community. From this perspective also, one can see the complete concert dancing together contrapuntally. While it would be the rankest Panglossian dishonesty to say that the bravura performances of the intellectual exile and the miseries of the displaced person or refugees are the same, it is possible, I think, to regard the intellectual as first distilling, then articulating the predicaments that disfigure modernity, mass deportation, imprisonment, population transfer, collective dispossession, and forced migration. What Said is saying here in kind of elementary but proleptic terms for people like Agamben and Badiou and so on and so forth is that this condition precipitated by the implosion of imperialism, Western civilization, let's call it, at this liminal point, has created a possibility. Could go either way. One way it could go is the reduction of these refugees, migrants, displaced persons, stateless people to bare life. Put them in the concentration camps, or versions of it, as is what's happening right now in France and in Spain, and Greece, and in countries like Greece, and so on and so on and so forth. Or energized by the analysis of their refugee status, they could become precisely in their refugee status potential mode of adequate resistance in a way that no other possibility is available. And beyond that, of course, the creation of a coming community which is communal, democratic, radically democratic, but not with all the apparatuses of capture that go along with liberal democratic society.
I was just wondering, and I've been playing with the ideas of the camp for the presentation. I was wondering if you would agree with the idea of sort of a simultaneous existence of refugee with something along the lines of the word hostage. Would you agree with there's a sort of convergence in those two aspects in Homo sacer, where you can go anywhere, roam the land as a refugee, but you're still bound by this introduction of the camp and the sense of being bound or trapped within the nation state at the same time.
No, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about that term hostage, but yeah, I would say that's a very fundamental condition of the modern Western world right now, with in the way they have the Western societies, the United States, the southwestern Mexican population, for example, of France, and then banlieues, Germany, and as I said, even countries far out on the western fringe of Western culture, Greece. These people are precisely hostages in that sense. They have some degree of freedom, but basically it's a freedom which is only superficial, because fundamentally they are a problem for the dominant cultures of these societies. And that is not, you should keep that in mind, because people like Agamben and especially are very strong on it. But these post-post structures, Rancière and so on and so forth, are extremely, I would say that, in fact, the point of departure of their critique of liberal capitalist democracy, contemporary liberal capitalist democracy, is based on their encounter with the problem of the refugee, the displaced person, the stateless people who have come now into the metropolis and have troubled the metropolis, and the way that problem is being resolved by the dominant liberal culture. That's the fundamental issue, and despite the fact that Said said this in 1993, that the refugee is being a prominent figure of modernity, it still exists in a more acute disturbing way right now. Let me just very quickly summarize, again for the sake of orientation and for the sake of this genealogy that combines Heidegger, Arendt, Said, Agamben, Badiou, Rancière, Zizek, Butler in this class. To summarize Said's indissolubly related anticipatory gestures, proleptic gestures, they include: 1, the idea of the event. Said did not use that word. This is about your term. But clearly, I mean, just from the way Said puts it, something radical happens with the implosion at that liminal moment when the logic of Western civilization fulfills itself and self-destructs. Self-destructs, precipitates the refugee. That is an event. That is an event that demands, therefore, as Said gives it all this attention, that demands thinking, pursuing the potentialities of. So, 1, the idea of the event itself. 2, the decentering of the anthropological man, capital letter. The decentering of anthropological man. Humanistic man in the traditional sense of the word humanism. 3, the naming of the void concealed by the plenary discourse of the dominant culture. The void that is revealed by way of the implosion of the Western imperial project. The void at the bottom. There's nothing there. Nothing's there. And that is symbolized. The void is symbolized by the refugee, the migrant. 4, the obsolescence of the traditional settled and domesticated means of resistance to imperial confinement. Means that have been permissible throughout the history of modernity, but which have shown themselves to be inadequate to the lives and potential of the human beings who exist in that world, in that democratic world. 5, the recognition of this post-imperial moment as an interregnum, an in-between time. An in-between time, or to retrieve his virtually forgotten meditation on beginnings, in beginnings, the radical secular now time. Again, that's not Said's language. Now time is not Said's language. That's a term that Agamben uses, that he derives from, as you'll see if you haven't already read his book, his analysis of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, the time that remains. But it's not accidental that Said's first and enabling book, this is what must not be forgotten. We didn't have a chance to talk about that very much, but it's crucial. Enabling book, Beginnings, in which he distinguishes between time as it's understood as it's been understood Western onto-theological tradition as a teleological conception of time with beginning, middle, and end. And where the end is there from the beginning, determining the process from the end, from outside. And beginnings, Said's term, to indicate that he's stripping the beginning from its dependency on the telos, on an end. What does that mean? That means that the beginning is, what other way can you put it? A now time. A now time. A lot of Saidis would go haywire in my identification of Said's beginnings with Benjamin's now time, or Agamben's version of it. I don't know how else you can put it. I just don't know. And I must say too that this one, I think that's one reason, this is speculation, I think that's one reason why Said's, quote, worldly critics don't pay much attention to that first book, Beginnings. They don't pay much attention to it. It's always question of Palestine, Orientalism, cultural imperialism, and all the writings we did about the Palestine situation. This again, this is a surmising. I'm speculating, but that's probably because that book contradicts their whole orientation to their critique of post-structuralism. Anyway, one more passage from Said. That now spells out a little bit more, because this comes right after, you recall this, comes right after the passage that I read at length, reread at length, on the migrant, the emergence of the migrant as the symbolic figure of modernity. And this has to do with, and this passage has to do with articulating in a kind of inaugural way what this kind of resistance would entail. How can the migrant, how can the refugee be the potential for a kind of resistance which is adequate to the neoliberal capitalist dispensation. And his model is not Agamben or Badiou, these post-structuralists, but Theodore Adorno. And not incidentally, Said is very aware, a Jew, a German Jew. And not incidentally, from Adorno, and particularly a German Jew who was exiled himself from Germany, to save his life, came to the United States and lived here in the United States specifically from the Adorno who wrote a memoir called Minima Moralia. Minimal morals, minimal potential. Subtitled Reflections from a Damaged Life. It's that specific aspect of Adorno. Adorno who articulates his damaged life in his memoir, Minima Moralia. And this is what Said, you'll remember, this is what Said said in invoking Adorno. He quotes Adorno, and the first part of this is a quotation from Adorno. The past life of emigres is, as we know, unknown. Is unknown. Says Adorno in Minima Moralia, subtitle Reflections from a Damaged Life. Why? Said asks. And he lets Adorno answer. Because anything that is not reified cannot be counted and measured. Ceases to exist. These people have no lives. Again, on the one hand, this could end up in the final reduction of bare life. But it could also be quite the opposite. Why? Because anything that is not reified cannot be counted and measured, ceases to exist, or, as Adorno says later, is consigned to mere background. That's the end of the quotation from Minima Moralia. Said goes on. Although the disabling aspects of this fate are manifest, potential to be further reduced to bare life, non-existence in the absolute sense of the word, its virtues or possibilities are worth exploring. Thus, the emigre consciousness, a mind of winter in Wallace Stevens' phrase, discovers in its marginality, in its exilic marginality, that, and here he quotes Adorno again, a gaze averted from the beaten track, a hatred of brutality, a search for fresh concepts not yet encompassed by the general pattern, is the last hope fought. Adorno's general pattern, referring to that general pattern, this is Said, Adorno's general pattern is what in another place he calls the administered society. Which Adorno uses the term to characterize Western modernity. Western modernity, liberal democratic capitalism, can be represented symbolically as the administered society, where everything is absolutely administered. That's Adorno's version and Said's version Agamben, and so on, and other, and the postal structure called biopoliticization of humanity, of life, administered society. Again, these terms are absolutely, they're different from each other, but they're absolutely continuous with each other, as you can clearly see. The administered society, or insofar as the irresistible dominance in culture are concerned, Adorno's second term, the consciousness industry. Again, you can hear the proleptically the resonance of resonantly the terms that is going to emerge in Agamben through Foucault and Hannah, the biopoliticization of humanity, the consciousness industry, the reduction of the consciousness to standing reserve, to disposable reserve. There is then not just the negative advantage of refuge. It's not simply a matter of refuge. This is Said. Not a matter of just a refuge with a refugee. In the immigrant's eccentricity, decentered state, marginal state, from the administered society, there is also the positive benefit of challenging the system, describing it in language, in language unavailable to those it has already subdued. That language which the post-structuralists found as ambiguous in the sense that it conceals its ideological and imperial and colonial status in the name of objectivity. A different language. And again, one of the things that all of these, from post-structuralists all the way through, increasingly and more definitively, are searching for a different language. But you can see this searching for the different language that these post-post structures are involved in has a source in the deconstruction of the language we have received in the Western tradition. Again, the continuity, that genealogy is, in my mind, unquestionable. There is also the positive benefit of challenging the system, describing it in language unavailable to those it has already subdued. And then Said ends by quoting in a very, very generous way. Let Adorno, this Jewish expatriate, have the last say. And so he quotes Adorno from Minimum Morelia. In an intellectual hierarchy which constantly makes everyone answerable, unanswerability alone can call the hierarchy directly by its name, the structuration of men from those who are in power and those who count, those who don't count. In an intellectual hierarchy which constantly makes everyone answerable, that's that interpolation, the interpolative, the call that creates a subjected subject. Unanswerability, the refusal to answer that call. That's where we've been going all the way along in this class, of course, by idea of human vocation as it has come down to us through the ages of Western civilization, the calling of Western civilization, mediated in America, of course, by the Protestant calling, which I'm talking about in this class. In an intellectual hierarchy which constantly makes everyone answerable, unanswerability alone can call the hierarchy directly by its name. Said does not invoke Bartleby, Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener. But you remember, you said over and over again, the Wall Street lawyer calls Bartleby to his typing for him. And Bartleby says, I would prefer not to. He refuses to answer his boss's call. And it turns Wall Street upside down. Absolutely upside down. Said does not mention it, but does not mention, at least here, I think he mentioned Bartleby in a number of other places, but I now got him somewhere in my notes, but I can't couldn't point them at the moment. But clearly, the Bartleby figure emerges in post-structural thinking as a fundamental symbolic figure for the mode of resistance which is appropriate to the conditions of contemporaneity, neoliberalism, capitalist contemporaneity. In those of you who have read The Coming Community, there's a chapter on Bartleby. The chapter does not quote Melville at all. This chapter is called Bartleby. But what he says in that small chapter, a couple of pages, is clearly derives from his very careful reading of Bartleby. Agamben has also written a long essay called Bartleby and Contingency, not accidentally, as a fundamental point of departure for his analysis of this mode of resistance that he identifies with the idea of the refugee, which he gets from Hannah Arendt. Again, just to make it very clear that the figure of Melville's figure of Bartleby is not sort of accidental, sort of well, just happened to Melville sort of just happened to put it in a way that struck a bell to a few people. Bartleby, the figure of Bartleby has become a constant in all of this post-structural criticism. You find it not only post-structural, but post-structural. You find it, for example, the figure of Bartleby central in Gaston Bachelard's book, I think it's called Disaster. The deconstructionist, very much part of the deconstructive context, Derrida and so on and so forth. You find it in Deleuze and Guattari, particularly in Deleuze, in Gilles Deleuze, who wrote an essay on Bartleby, precisely in terms of the potential of his refusing to be answerable to the call for resistance. You'll also find it indirectly, and I'll want to spend a little bit of time on this, in Agamben, at the very end of Agamben's coming community, where he talks about what happened at Tiananmen Square in 1994 in China. The people he clearly identifies with Bartleby. We'll come back to that later on. And of course, Bartleby, for Melville, and above all, for those post-structuralists and post-structuralists who Melville influenced through the character of Bartleby, is an exilic figure. He's a refugee from American society, from Wall Street. The refugee. So, everything then vis-a-vis one, resistance, and two, the coming community resides in the way we read this figure of the refugee. Why, therefore, Said's invocation of what he calls the exilic consciousness is the way into rethinking our condition in the contemporary world. And it is precisely in the context of the post-structuralist, the figure of the refugee that Agamben will pick up on, having his roots in the Heideggerian understanding of Geworfenheit, thrownness in the world, and mediated through, and this is I want to pay a little bit attention to a writer, a theoretician whom we did not have, I did not include in the course, but who is crucial to this whole project, and that's Hannah Arendt. Particularly, I'm going to focus particularly on Hannah Arendt's notion of the conscious pariah. But more specifically than the conscious pariah, the essay she wrote shortly after she came to the United States, very early on in the early 1950s, mid-1950s, early 1950s, in an essay, long essay, totally overlooked by Arendtians who did not want to bother with her exilic consciousness because they were much more interested in what she had to say about the context that was made prominent by Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, at the expense of her Heideggerian, Nietzschean Heideggerian roots. An essay she called We Refugees. We Refugees. I'm going to stop here and pick up from this moment on. But you'll see that she becomes that notion of the refugee, or her